Welcome to Mott MacDonald's podcast, Nature Positive, The Inside Story. In this podcast series, our host Julia Baker will be talking to industry leaders and experts about nature-related policy, advisory, law, and much more. In today's episode, Julia sits down with Richard Broadbent to discuss how the law teaches us to be better, plus insights into habitat banks and conservation covenants. So don't forget to subscribe and, most importantly, enjoy this episode.
Richard, welcome to our podcast. It's lovely to have you.
Oh, thank you for inviting me. I'm so pleased to be here.
How would you describe your job?
Oh, well, so it's the core of it is nature conservation law, so habitats and species and the regulation of those. So I came to Freeths from Natural England, and of course, Natural England is a scientific advisor on the natural environment, but also it's regulator when it comes to species and protected sites. And so at Freeths, that's what we do. It's the core element of what I do as part of the environmental law team at Freeths. But increasingly now, it's natural capital. So biodiversity net gain, nutrient neutrality, and water neutrality now. So there's a range of different things, which is sort of an offshoot of the sort of regulatory stuff that's the core of the practice. And it's actually very helpful looking at those natural capital matters through the lens of that regulatory framework as well, and having an appreciation of how law and policy apply in that area.
And congratulations on being the Ends Palace.
Thank you.
I love the way that you describe the law as a teacher. You know, I've never really thought about it before that way. You always kind of think, oh, it's enforcement, but it's teaching us to do better, to be better. When it comes to our industry and, you know, nature and biodiversity, why do you think the law's a teacher?
Well, I think that's one of the qualities of the law. Environmental law, well, you know, the law is reached for as Elizabeth Fisher says, as the most legitimate and stable medium with which to solve collective problems, right? And environmental law is about trying to collectively solve the problems that we're facing, increasingly so in response to industrialization, the modernization, and so on. So the law is reached for as the way to do that. But the law also has this incredible capacity to be a teacher, what the academics would call its normative power, right? To set values. But I see the law as a teacher because what it requires us to do is it talks about what we value as important, and that inculcates within us values around that, and you can see that happening in real time. You know, there are attitudes towards the natural environment that we have now, which we just didn't have 50 years ago. You know, you wouldn't have carried out, an assessment of the ecological impacts of your development in the same way that we do now. Decades ago, it wasn't part of it. But as we've valued that and used the law as a way of trying to collectively respond to these problems, it now becomes part of what we do.
It's like the normalization within society.
Well, that's what it is, isn't it? So it has a great value there. And what is the law at its core trying to teach us? Well, environmental law at its best is about trying to institutionalize stewardship obligations towards the natural environment, trying to make us better stewards of the natural environment.
It's a lovely way to put it, isn't it?
Yeah, well, at its best, that's what it does, right? And we put rules around the things that we value. So we're putting rules around the natural environment, with the idea that stewardship is the obligation that comes from that. The downside of using the law in this way is that it can become, over time, burdensome, and it can become overly fussy, and it can weigh you down. But if you fully appreciate the law as a teacher and take into yourself and the considerations of it, then it doesn't become burdensome, it becomes freeing. So when it comes to the natural environment, if you're already thinking as part of your, outline for your development, no, I need to think about nature as part of this, and you're doing that right from the start, well, then you're going to make informed decisions. You're not going to feel the burden of the law. You're actually working together with it. So at its best, that's what it can do.
And It's such an interesting way of putting it, actually, because I think, I've certainly seen biodiversity net gain shift the conversation for biodiversity like much earlier.
Yeah.
There's so much talk about biodiversity net gain of, like the metric and rightly so about local planning authorities having enough resources and that's really important. But my experience so far since the 12th of February has been massively, like suddenly B&G is right up in the early stages. But for the moment, it's more compliance than value. And I think that's probably just a time thing. We'll get there over time.
Yeah.
So the law's having that effect. Yeah. But can the law move us from compliance to value? Or is that more, I guess, of the cultural change because the law is there?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, ideally, that's what the law's trying to do, right? And I'm so pleased to hear that people are thinking about it at the early stages, because that is absolutely the right way to go about doing it. Environmental law becomes a problem to you if you try and deal with it late on in the process. If you're trying to retrofit it on, bolt it on as an afterthought because you've missed a stage earlier on, that's when the real difficulties arise. But if you're thinking about these things going in, and that's true not just for biodiversity, and again, it's true for pretty much every area of environmental regulation, then you've got, it's almost like having a magic wand, thinking about it early, right? You have the ability to deal with it and manage it. So that's really good. In terms of what you're saying about it's just compliance, and I get that, and it's seen as another burden. And what it's going to require is a thoughtful and skillful application of this regime so that it doesn't feel just like another burden that gets in the way of other things, but actually is something which we can, that is something that feels right to be doing this in the right way, seeing the benefits that come with it, associated benefits that come with it by having nature built into your development. Then it will feel less like a burden and more like, essentially doing the right thing.
Yeah, and it's not enough that the law is there. Yeah. It needs to be enforced, and people need to know that there's a really effective enforcement regime. Yeah. So biodiversity net gains come in, and everyone's saying, a lot of people are really concerned, saying, how on earth is this going to be enforced? It's for 30 years. Yeah. Local planning authorities don't have enough resources to deal with the applications, let alone enforce it. Yeah. So how on earth? And I'm just interested, firstly, what is the balance between the law being there, but people knowing that it's going to be enforced? Is it enough that mandatory net gain has come in, or does it need that proof that people are enforcing it? And then what does good law enforcement look like? Yeah. Is it a series of Section 106s where, people are going out and talking it? Like, in your mind, is it literally that, I guess some people would call it the heavy-handed approach? Is that good law enforcement? Yeah. Those are really really good questions. And the thing about it, the regime has to have some teeth. Regimes without teeth are not going to operate effectively. So the idea is to have is inculcate these obligations of stewardship. That when we build something, we're going to put something back for nature, and there's strong sort of moral and ethical dimensions to that, as well as the business case,
and a business case to it too, right? Yeah. So it's good for nature. It's good for people. It's good for their physical well-being. It's good for their mental well-being. Those are all good ethical reasons to be doing it. It also is better. The property value is better. The workforce retention is better if they're working in a beautiful environment. There are other reasons too as to why it's important. Done well, done effectively. But like any regime, it has to have teeth, and this regime has those teeth built into it. And the way it builds it into it is having legal mechanisms which legally secure. So when it's on-site biodiversity net gain, if it's significant, then it has to be secured through a planning condition, through a Section 106 agreement, through a conservation covenant. And if it's off-site habitat being created, it's secured through a Section 106 and a conservation covenant. Well, built into that is going to be a plan for how you deliver the habitat. It's going to be monitoring, reporting, and enforcement steps. Now, that is all necessary. Otherwise, this thing is a mirage. So you have to have those elements. Now, it'll come down to the wise application of that in practice. So overly heavy-handed enforcement of that would be problematic because the creation of a habitat is inherently uncertain. So there needs to be a dialogue between the landowner who's being regulated and the body regulating, whether it's a local authority through a Section 106 or a responsible body through a conservation covenant. A sensible dialogue about how to tweak what you're doing so that you still achieve the outcomes that you want to achieve. So an overly heavy-handed approach to that would be disastrous. On the flip side of that, if the Section 106 is underpinning this, and local planning authorities are responsible for the enforcement of this regime, and they lack the resources and the bandwidth to do that, well, then there's going to be a lack of enforcement there. And I think there's a lot of concern around how that's going to operate.
But fundamentally, I think what you're saying is, I've not heard that before. You know, the way that enforcement is described as that ongoing dialogue between, it is about checking in, and it is about, I think, you know, sending the monitoring reports for developers, sending it to monitoring or the offset provider to the local planning authority, and to maintain that dialogue in terms of what's the progress towards biodiversity net gain, rather than behind closed doors, suddenly something's gone wrong and have that heavy-handed approach, which seems to be the way that people kind of, I guess it's about perceptions. Can we talk about perceptions? Because that's the way that you described, which I think is a really important collaboration, because ultimately, you know, it's about making sure that biodiversity net gain is successful and that dialogue is important, versus the perception of enforcement, if you like, of B&G.
I know. Well, that's a really good, and it's a good question, and there's a real tension there. So, you know, in the period 2006 through to 2019, when I was at Natural England, I was at Natural England for a chunk of that time, and during that time, we carried out 14 prosecutions for damage to SSSIs.
So how many years was that?
So from 2006 through to 2019, so that kind of period there.
Right, 14.
Yeah.
Gosh.
Yeah. 14 prosecutions. Now,
that's quite a lot.
Well, we were pursuing the angles that we were given.
Yeah.
You know,
given how hard it is.
And that's the thing with wildlife crime; it's exceptionally difficult to prosecute because of the evidential burden and the lack of evidence when it comes to many wildlife crimes. Also, one of the great things that Natural England has is civil sanctions. So it has a larger chest of regulatory tools that they can use. So there's different tools that you can use at different times to manage different situations, and that's all, you know, good too. But critics would say, well, that's too few. There should have been more, and you're not taking that regulatory role seriously. And perception's a really important thing there. And of course, when we did secure a prosecution, we had to, you know, it was important for us to tell the world about it, so that had that deterrent effect. Now, with biodiversity net gain, it's going to be different to that. You know, built into this is monitoring and reporting and inspections being carried out by the local authority and or the responsible bodies, the case may be. And so the enforcement is in your face and will necessarily be transparent. People can seek that information out, you know.
Yes, both on the planning portal for on-site B&G and then on the gains register site for off-site.
Yeah. So there'll be a great deal of scrutiny around this. And you can just imagine an area for legal challenge if the perception is that, you know, action isn't being taken. So, you know, that there needs to be a careful sort of management of that perception versus what's right in reality. And I think what's going to be needed is some sort of middle point here, because, like I was saying, over-regulation in this area is going to be very problematic, you know, and there needs to be a dialogue. But if that dialogue drifts into vagueness, then of course that needs to be reined in.
It's like the magic spot in the middle, isn't it?
I know, right?
Yeah.
And there'll be a lot of scrutiny on this, I'm sure.
And rightly so, because I think, you know, the fact that it's obviously a topic of conversation, and we know that, you know, just how much there is.
there's going to be a role here for the Office for Environmental Protection, whose role now is, watchdog for the environment.
Yeah, of course.
To keep an eye on how this stuff is emerging.
Do you think biodiversity net gain can better connect people with nature?
Yeah, I think it can. And I think it must. I think we need to have that. It's...
And I'll tell you why I asked that question.
Go on. Yeah.
Because, and we were just talking about this actually, the nature that we have here today is the nature that we value.
Yeah.
That's the nature that gets the laws to protect itself.
Yeah.
I mean, there's so many species going extinct, but only a few get protection. So there is this value around that. So, and why do people value nature? It's the charismatic species. But I think I think it's such an interesting question, because if biodiversity net gain can help better connect people with nature in careful ways, it's not a free for all. These are habitats for wildlife. Yeah. But in careful ways, then I think it really brings us back to that place, when we were before, and with that. So I think it's a careful balance. But where do you see that balance being made? Yeah.
Well, in my view, I have a sort of presumption in favor of giving people access to nature. And I feel like that based on our experience at Natural England, where we had a program on connecting people with nature. And the importance of that. The English are a uniquely landless people. 82% of us live in urban areas. 1% of the population owns half the country. Only 6% of the country is actually urbanized, right? I mean, 8% of it's built on, 6% is homes and gardens, right? So 82% of the population clustered into 6% of it. Also, in this country, not very much of the landscape you can have access to, and as we speak, as we record this, there's a case that's in the Supreme Court about camping rights on Dartmoor, right? One of the few places in the country where you can camp out in a national park.
Oh, right.
And that's in the Supreme Court today over whether that's actually a right or not. So, there are some very deep structural issues within this country. Now, it is what it is. It's a product of its history, and fine. But if that's the case, for God's sakes, then let's try and allow people to have nature built in to the developments that they live in, and have access to habitats that are being created for this purpose. And let's have a presumption in favor of that. And I absolutely get the point that that in some instances that's not appropriate and needs to be managed in certain ways. And in fact, one of the counter arguments about the Dartmoor camping is, well, look, actually, people trash the landscape when they're in it, so we should not be giving this permissive, this right to people.
Well, it's just careful design.
Exactly. There are ways you can manage this, right? And we can invest more in our countryside codes and things like that. There's a whole range of things that we can do to address this. But I do think we need to have that. And why? Well, because as I was saying earlier, we protect the things that we value. And if you're not spending time in nature, then you're not building up that relationship with it that makes you want to value it. And we do that at our own risk.
Yes, yeah, exactly. I'm interested in your work in supporting local planning authorities with habitat banks. Yeah. So how did that start? What have you been doing? And what is some advice, for people who are thinking, I'm going to start up a habitat bank? What's your... so go through the work and then...
Yeah, sure. So it was a project a year or so ago now, where one of our clients, Plymouth City Council, were looking very seriously at this as an option. Creating habitat banks on land that they own, which for various reasons are not going to be used for anything else, and yet they're operating at a cost to the council in terms of their operation. So why not use those for biodiversity? And the idea there is that if there is private sector money coming into this area, why not divert some of that at publicly owned land and to improve it for nature, and not just for nature in the area, but for the communities that live in that area too.
It's like a win-win-win.
Yeah. And it's it's a good idea. Now the thing to keep in mind when you're doing that is making sure that you're not doing that at a price per unit which undercuts the emerging market, because then you're cutting that off at its knees, right? So you want to make
right. Okay, that's really, really important. Yeah. So let's go through that. So you've got local planning authority with a habitat bank, and you're talking about they might undercut others.
So you need to make sure that the price that you're charging for these units is competitive within the market. You're not undercutting it in any way.
So local planning authority might be in competition with a farmer or local wildlife group.
Well, because there's a market's emerging.
Yes. So they're one other market player.
Yeah.
Got you.
But the problem that local authorities are facing is that as this market is emerging, there are going to be shortfalls in their area. Either they're not coming forward, or not the habitat units that people need are not coming forward. And that creates distortions in prices, right? It's supply and demand.
Yes.
So it's a way of you going, okay, I can divert this money into publicly owned land for the communities that we serve. That's good. But also I can have a sense of an idea that we can supply units that are needed. You can have an idea about that.
So where's the shortfall?
So you can think like that. As long as you do that in a way which doesn't encourage upon the ability of the private sector, landowners to be able to bring forward their projects. But that's the idea there, and the mechanics of it are, the way that we've gone about it here is, and this is actually what there's government guidance on this that suggests these are the options available to you. If you're a local authority creating using a Section 106, you can't obviously enter that Section 106 with yourself.
Yes.
You create a separate legal entity.
Right.
And going to run the habitat bank.
Right.
As a separate legal personality, and then you can have a Section 106 with that.
Okay.
The other options that government talks about is if you're not a unitary authority, then you get another public body to enforce against you, or you just lease your land and have a tenant and the tenant runs it.
Got ya.
So you have these various options. And of course, with conservation covenants becoming available now, you can just enter into a conservation covenant, and then the responsible body is enforcing against you. And so you have that option as well. So there are various ways in which you can do this. But the idea is that that's what you that's what you try and do, and it's been I think it's a very good way of bringing money into these areas. And there's other things you can do on these sites as well, because as long as it doesn't cut across your ability to use it for nature, you can put other things on there too. I know, solar array or something like that. You can stack other natural capital units on there, like nutrient neutrality, for example. Yeah. So
what's your advice if someone's saying, okay, sounds good, habitat bank.
Yeah.
I understand what you're saying about I don't want to overcompete, with others.
Yeah.
What's your advice? Where do people start with that?
So I would definitely, there's two things you need to have, without which you can't really make any informed decision. So one is obviously you need an ecological baseline, and you need to consider what land you've got, where does it make sense, what units you can create from that, what's going to be the demand for those units over, a 5-10 year period. And then you can do some informed calculations about that, which is what's going to be needed. The other thing you need to do, so you do the ecological baseline, and you need a business case, essentially.
Right.
That does those two things. So you can see what you can produce and what the business case is that underpins it.
Yeah.
And once you're satisfied that you've got a plan there that works, that is financially sustainable, works within the market that you have, locally or nationally for particular units, well, then you can bring in the lawyers and we'll legally secure that, in accordance with the governance regime, that the local authority wants to put in place. So that's the idea.
I think it's also it's being aware of what questions to answer.
Yeah,
isn't it? I mean, you might just think, okay, I can plant a hedgerow here, but your point about what's the demand, and having that matching thing, and what's the demand that others are not, supplying, in that kind of thing.
Yeah, and you can see there's already bubbles of undersupply of certain things. I mean, one of the things that was talked about over the summer, I've written an article on it, is open mosaic habitat, high distinctiveness open mosaic habitat, which is what you find on brownfield sites, right? Yeah,
that's a really tricky one.
It's really tricky because it's a high distinctiveness. Well, that's inherently difficult and expensive to create. You can create it, but it's difficult, and so you'll have a an undersupply potentially of those units because they're difficult to make and they're going to be expensive. And then you get a situation where the brownfield site itself costs less than the units you need for it, and of course that cuts against government policy to build on brownfield sites. So you have these difficulties.
Answered by the market.
Well, and that's the thing. Do you panic and tweak the metric to try and get rid of the problem? Or do you just let the market do what it's meant to be doing and respond to those price signals and bring in that supply? And that's what you need to do. Now, there's a short-term pain associated with that.
Yes.
But that's...
the market responds.
Otherwise, why have a market mechanism underpinning it? But what a local authority could try and do is try and think, okay, well, what's the undersupply? How could we, address that? How could we adapt, and try and address those things? And
you mentioned conservation covenants for people who aren't sure what they are.
Yeah.
What are they?
Yeah.
And are they a thing? I mean,
They're a thing. They're indeed a thing.
Right.
Yeah.
I've just seen a couple of blogs on it.
Yeah. Yeah. So I've been working on conservation covenants for about a decade now,
right?
As an idea, my involvement in it came about through the Law Commission writing their report on conservation covenants, and that came out of work they were doing on the law of easements. So it was a property-related project they were doing, and as they were doing this work on the law of easements, they discovered that in other jurisdictions they have this thing called conservation covenants. And they found it curious that we don't have that in our jurisdiction. Now, the reason for that is because in property law, restrictive covenants run with the land. So, preventing you from doing something, that will run with the land to successors in title.
Got you. Yeah.
The positive covenants, as in you need to spend money to go and manage the land and do things in a positive way. Well, that binds the people who make that arrangement, but doesn't bind successors in title because it's not seen as appropriate in law to burden a successor in title down the line with obligations which were entered into many years before.
Right. Gosh.
But the idea of conservation covenants is it creates a mechanism which does enable that to happen, and it can operate in perpetuity. So you have both restrictive and positive covenants running with the land, and so. DEFRA sponsored the Law Commission's work on that. I was seconded to the Law Commission. I helped work on that with them. And then when I came back to Natural England, the Law Commission report just went onto a shelf and it could have stayed there forever. It was important for me that I felt like this is another really helpful tool in the toolbox for nature conservation. Because a lot of the legal mechanisms that we use to try and secure gains for nature are in some way linked to other regimes, normally the planning regime, relying on Section 106s. But that's a planning obligation, okay, being applied in the nature conservation area. And there are other things like conservation covenants in Natural England. We had a power under Section 7 of the National Environment and Rural Communities Act to enter into agreements which are sort of like conservation covenants, but that's just one party being able to do it. How about everyone has the opportunity to do this? So conservation covenants, I thought, was an important tool that could be used. So I was chipping away talking about it within DEFRA and Natural England. But when it came to biodiversity, and again, when the Environment Bill was being pulled together, it was seen as a mechanism which could be used and helped to be used in that context to legally secure these habitat banks. It can be used for other things other than that, but it's another tool that can be used in that space. Right. And so then it gets included into the Environment Bill and into the Environment Act. Yeah. And so now you can enter into conservation covenants that all those provisions are now part of our law. For a while, you weren't able to, because it required the Secretary of State to designate responsible bodies with whom you could enter into a conservation covenant with. Yeah. But we now have that too.
We're getting more in line.
Yeah, and more every day. So if there's a web page, it tells you who's on there. And then at Freeths, we've helped draft the first conservation covenants to be used in a biodiversity net gain setting. So I've kind of seen it from its very beginning all the way through to actually its application now. And and unsurprisingly, I'm a big evangelist for it. I think these are things that we should be using, and particularly, I live on Dartmoor, and a lot of work is going there into trying to bring back the temperate Atlantic rainforest, Celtic rainforest, right? And
Oh, wow.
so there it's sort of oak tree creation, like Wistman's wood. That's one of the last remnants of the sort of the rainforest that we have, right? Well, it takes 200 years for an oak tree to grow, 200 years to mature, 200 years to die. These are long-term things. Okay, so have a legal tool that's capable of running with the land, binding successors in title. It requires not to chop it down, restrictive covenants, but also to manage it in a way which is optimal for these forests that we're creating. So it's I think an ideal tool that can be used in that way, and I'd like it. Environmental law has a maturity problem. Even now, it doesn't stand on its own feet. It sort of blows in the political winds,
right?
And it hasn't quite yet got its own center of gravity. It's sort of symbiotic on other things, right? But a conservation covenant feels like a tool that allows it to stand on its own feet. It's not dependent on another regime. It's for nature conservation, and works for it. So
I think it'll be the slow burn.
Yeah, it will.
I think.
I know. And it's an alien thing, and it'll take a while for it to. But
it's one of those things that would be word of mouth. People say, "Oh, that's so good," and then become more and more. Yeah. Because also we know as you start to build those. But how extraordinary that you've actually seen the first one as well.
Yeah, and I think it's in life there's no solutions, just trade-offs, right? So you'll be looking at the trade-offs between having a Section 106 and a conservation covenant. And I think now at the moment, if local authorities are struggling with the bandwidth to process those Section 106s, it's taking them 18 months, say, well, then you're going to go with someone who is going to turn a conservation covenant around with you in a matter of weeks.
Wow.
So that's, it'll cost you more, but you have that benefit.
I didn't realize it was that quick.
Well, because that these organizations are going to do it for that purpose and that purpose alone. Understood. Yeah. And they're going to have ecologists working with them. So you're going to have a dialogue there with a dedicated team who's going to be working with you on this.
Yeah.
And also, if you've got land holdings around the country, well, rather than have different Section 106s for different habitats in different parts of the country with different local authorities, you could have one conservation covenant with one responsibility, or several conservation covenants but with the same responsibility. And that means you can sort of streamline the way that you do monitoring and reporting and so on. So there are trade-offs here, and people will look at that in the marketplace and think, okay, well, make a decision.
But I think you're right in terms of it's what's going to be optimal for one person won't be the same for another.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's about giving the options.
You've got to give people options.
Yeah.
A lack of options is going to be one of the things that might undermine this whole regime. So give people options. They can make informed decisions about things. That's the right way to do it.
Richard, is there anything important we've not yet talked about?
I think one of the things we should probably talk a little bit more about is the cost associated. Is it another cost here associated with development? And there was already concerns about your ability to create affordable housing. These another more costs that's going to be passed on to essentially the people buying these properties ultimately. And the prices of properties in this country are far too high anyway. And it's another thing that could restrict supply because it's another complication, another sort of burden. And quite frankly, I am very, aware of and alive to and, appreciative of those concerns. I get that. And I guess the only, the counterpoint to that is, well, look, BNG is a way of what economists call getting to internalize your negative externalities. Putting a price on your pollution,
right? Because
then
someone's got to pay for it at some stage.
The environment's already paying for it.
Yeah,
it's just you don't pass that price on, right? So this internalizes that environmental impact, and so that's actually a market correction, if anything. And the structural issues, which mean that there's an undersupply of housing and the horrendous cost of housing, are really linked to other things. So yes, whilst this is another burden on top, and I get that, there are other things here that need to be resolved at a more fundamental level about how this whole thing operates. And I don't think free riding of the environment is something people would particularly want to. I think when given the choice, I think people go, yeah, no, I do want the development that I live in to be a net gain for nature. I do.
I think it's such an important point though, because you're right. They're absolutely suddenly seen as this additional cost.
Yeah.
But your first point was it's not the law that's the cost; it's the way that people manage it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So there is a more efficient way of managing this, which keeps the cost down, and there are obviously costs, in terms of the habitat creation or whatever. But I think there's a fundamental: what's your management approach to implementing the law, and are you making it, or is it creating a burden because it's not been managed?
Yeah.
I think also there's some really interesting work done on value for money or return on investment and biodiversity net gain.
Sure.
And that is because it's seen as a cost, but even if there's if you like, a monetary value, it's for society somewhere over there.
Yeah.
Whereas I'm a project manager, I've got costs in and I don't have anything coming in, Julia, thank you very much. But what is the return on investment for that particular project?
I know.
And I think there's a really important discussion when you bring it down to that level. We can do things like integrate climate resilience and biodiversity net gains. You're avoiding the costs of, disruption from climate change to your infrastructure down the line, or, like you say, building in connections with people for nature. So I think it's really important to not listen to that conversation, but come up with a way of answering it.
Oh yes, absolutely. Yeah. The first flat I moved into in London when I started as a lawyer, right? The only bit of nature I could see for the years that we lived there was a patch of artificial grass stuck on top of a guardhouse.
Oh gosh!
Essentially,
where was that?
This is in Islington.
Oh, was it? Gosh,
and then
different
when our first baby came along, we moved across the road to a different. It was twice the cost, right? But there was a garden, which the apartments were built around, and there was a little pond there, and a duck would have its chicks there every year, right? That garden sold that flat more to us than any other factor. Yeah. It was the fact that suddenly we could see trees at the height of our balcony, and we had a little bit of garden space, and then this little pond, and actual wildlife on it.
And it matters.
It mattered in a way that you couldn't put a value on it, but that was the thing that made the decision to pay twice the cost to go and live there.
Wow.
So yeah, no, it's really important, and it turns out people actually want to live in nice places. That's fair enough.
It is, and I think you're right about the cost and the burden. There's a couple of cases where the word on the street is B&G's made it unviable, or and something like that. And I think it's us as an industry getting better at that point, but also really understanding what you're talking about is that these are actually better places to live, to work, to build.
Absolutely.
There is so much excitement about biodiversity net gain, but what is your greatest fear at the moment?
So that cost piece that we've just been talking about, I think that's the thing, because it's seen as another burden, and like I was saying before, environmental law has a maturity problem, and that it can blow in the political winds. And we saw that last autumn, where the government looked to change the rules on nutrient neutrality, not to deal with nutrient neutrality, but to create a legal loophole, so they wouldn't have to deal with it. So it has this maturity problem, and if it's seen as another burden, and there's lots of negativity around it, and in a situation where there's a cost of living crisis and a housing crisis, those are real concerns, and this thing will have to be done very carefully, very sensibly. So that that's a worry I have. Another worry I have is over the enforcement piece that we talked about. Will that be taken seriously? Because this regime will not stand unless there's that enforcement piece. Now, I don't think the enforcement alone is what the value of this of law and policy like this that inculcate that stewardship value, right? That's what we should be trying to create. If we're relying only on enforcement, then it's problematic. But that enforcement needs to be there.
It's part of the mix.
Exactly, right. So that and making that operate, and we're too early into this to have any feel for what that's going to be like. So those are concerns I have. But then the other concern is, and it touches on what we're also talking about, is I'm worried that a large proportion of the population just doesn't have access to nature. And what are the we're living with the side effects of that, whether it's mental health or obesity or whatever it is, right? We're living with those side effects. Well, we need to address that, and this is one of the ways that we can address that.
Yeah, and I think it really brings it home in terms of when you put that, like human cost. What's the cost of not doing this?
I know, right?
Bring that up.
Yeah,
Richard, you have had the most extraordinary career, and thank you so much for spending time with us. I'm interested though, who's your role model?
I have so many role models because I've worked with such wonderful people. So there's so many people at Natural England who I've loved working with. Julie Lunt, who trained me up and was my boss for many years at Natural England. Marion Spain, the chief executive. She's fantastic. Tony Juniper, for example. And there's people in the academic world I've worked with as well who are great. Maria Lee and all the gang at UCL who are fantastic, and my current colleagues as well. Penny Simpson is one of the best environmental lawyers I've ever seen. She's fantastic. So there's lots in that sense. I think if I was looking at someone from history, I have a lot of respect for Barbara Ward, who is incredibly bright, very energetic, very sort of knowledgeable, thinker and writer of the sort of middle part of the 20th century. But she worked on development and on addressing the sort of income gap between the North and the South, and addressing that. But then through the 60s, saw the link between that and nature. And she was instrumental in pulling together what became the 1972 Stockholm Conference on the Environment, the United Nations Conference on the Environment, which in environmental law and policy circles is seen as like the Big Bang moment for this whole thing.
Gosh, how
because that then leads to all the various conventions that follow that. 1992 Rio Convention, 2002 Johannesburg, and on and on. And it all comes from that point. But for her, there was an important moral and ethical dimension to environmental law, which was linking it together with humanitarian concerns, with sustainable development, with alleviating poverty, and that sort of moral force was very important. And people she worked with and knew, and so on. And so there's at the heart of what we do, there was someone who saw all these connections, and I think it's important for me, in the way I do this area of law, to keep seeing those connections. And that's why, for me, access to nature is a really important
Absolutely. Yeah. And for someone who's listening in thinking, okay, I'm in, I'd love to have a job or a career in environmental law, what's your advice?
So I came to environmental law. I mean, when I started, when I was a kid, I never knew environmental law was a job, right? Who knew, right? I went to law school, didn't know either. It wasn't anything that was taught to us. I got into environmental law because I wanted to do I wanted to get another postgraduate qualification. I was working in Holborn, just around the corner from UCL, and one of the partners I worked with was used to go to UCL, and he said, you should go there, go to the faculty, it's brilliant. The faculty of law is excellent. And it just so happened that the firm said, well, we kind of need some, no one does environmental law here. How about you study that? So pretty much day one, starting that course, I just fell in love with this area of law. Suddenly I was like, oh my gosh, this is the thing I've been wanting to do.
Amazing.
Yeah. And it was serendipity, really.
Yeah. That's not chance. That's
But all the things in my life that led to that moment kind of fell into place. I thought, no, this is the thing. fortunately, whilst I was doing that course, a role came up at Natural England. I was able to get that, and I worked there, and was able to practice in this area. So I think for people, looking at this, if you've got it's sometimes there can be quite an odd route into this, and some of the people I work with have come from different backgrounds and ended up in environmental law, and I think that's great because it gives you a richer sort of feel and a different perspective on it. So I guess don't be deterred by the fact that it's not on offer. I think read up around it, spend time in nature. All of those things make you authentically connected with it, and keep your eyes out for things like like I did with a master's at LLM, studying it. Look for those firms that do actually offer it and offer it properly. They do the nature conservation law and the sort of the usual pollution permitting sort of waste stuff that law firms do. And get a sense for it. But because I came to it from a slightly odd angle.
It's the best way.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, and if you know a firm that does it, try and get us to comment with them. Sit with. For that reason, I try and make time for people to do some comments with me, so they can get a taste of what it's like. Do that, and if you're getting nowhere, still join UK Environmental Law Association. It's that's a great place to network with people and meet people. So even if you're not practicing it yet, or you're still a student, it's a great chance to meet
part of the community.
Exactly, because it's actually a very small group of lawyers who practice in this area still.
Yeah.
So if you do that and are active in it, you'll get to see them all and meet them all.
That's some good advice. Richard, thank you very much indeed.
My pleasure. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.